depending on the other symptoms and signs. So one sign or symptom, doesn't matter which one, is not sufficient. It has been shown now in many studies already. But that several symptoms work has been also shown in many studies already. Now recently we conducted a Delphi process cosmogy study and identified 13 essential items to monitor GI function, or actually dysfunction. Function measuring is even more difficult as monitoring dysfunction in the ICU, or actually not possible. And we also provided consensus definitions for these 13 essential items. And it's very complex. It is complex. We need to live with it that it is complex until we maybe get some monitoring to measure GI dysfunction. But now we monitor with assessment of clinical signs. And if you see here, there are clinical signs or symptoms on one hand, measurable parameters, and clinical entities or syndromes. And there are, we specifically kind of defined or put for the panel all different kinds. So vomiting is under gastroparesis, gastric residual volume is under gastroparesis, so that we have several kind of categories that are defined. And if we monitor them all, we can assess them more specifically. Because if we just say gastroparesis, then it can be defined differently in the studies and we don't have enough information afterwards. So these items and definitions are meant to be used in clinical studies assessing enteronutrition and GI dysfunction, of course, also. So, and then we take the next block, and GI paralysis can be a combination of any of those that you see here in the next box. And bowel ischemia can be a combination of any of those. And then the topic is enteral feeding intolerance. And actually all those can be signs or manifestations of intolerance to enteronutrition. And we also defined in this cosmogy process treatment of intolerance to enteronutrition with prokinetics, post-pyloric feeding, and parenteral nutrition. And again, this is how to document that we would have data to analyze, because so far data on all this is scarce. And also in many nutrition studies, GI dysfunction is rarely assessed properly or defined or reported as outcomes. And what does it mean practically? If a patient has large GRV and we give prokinetics, and the patient has got less GRV and we can give more enteronutrition and everybody is happy. Or we start post-pyloric feeding in a patient with large GRV and drain GRV, it's still high, but we take it out and we can give more enteronutrition. But if at the same time the patient develops diarrhea, abdominal distension, and intra-abdominal hypertension, then actually GI dysfunction went worse. So we didn't do anything good for the patient. And this is very important in supporting the complex assessment and not just looking at one single parameter, because we can really harm our patients with looking at only one item. So if we start enteronutrition and look for gastric feeding intolerance, and we see that there is no gastric feeding intolerance, and then we increase enteronutrition and reassess. Or if we see that there was gastric feeding intolerance and we did stop or kept low rate enteral feeding, gave prokinetics or gave post-pyloric feeding, then we again forgot all about the lower parameters. What about bowel distension? What about diarrhea? And actually these can develop in all patients, those without gastric feeding intolerance, those with gastric feeding intolerance, and those with already treated gastric feeding intolerance. And it's important because if the problem is really only gastroparesis, then we can solve the problem with gastroprokinetics. But if the problem is lower down, if the problem is in small bowel, and impaired gastric emptying is actually secondary to small bowel dysmotility, then we make it only worse. We have limited effect, first of all, and we possibly can generate severe consequences like bowel ischemia and perforation due to overdistension of the small bowel. What do nutrition guidelines say about enteral feeding intolerance? Well, Aspen and French guidelines don't say anything, actually. Just one comment I found, gastrointestinal tolerance may limit how much enteral nutrition can be provided. And it's in the comment to high versus low energy recommendation. Because they say enteral and parenteral route are equal, actually. Interestingly, they say no supplemental parenteral nutrition before day 7, even though in the first week enteral and parenteral are equal. So this seems controversial in both in American and French guidelines. Maybe, it's never written, but I could think of that the reasoning could be respecting enteral feeding intolerance as a sign of organ dysfunction and or metabolic intolerance, and say that if we can give something enterally, then don't give parenteral additionally to it. Maybe it is this, but I don't know. I don't see completely the rationale or logics about differentiating parenteral, total parenteral and supplemental parenteral in these guidelines. ESPEN guidelines, importantly, there were not many changes in 2022 compared to 2019. It was only actually practical guidelines with some updates. And for me, the most important update was actually this, what may look only small, but actually is relevant. In 2019, we said all strategies to maximize enteral nutrition tolerance should be attempted before one starts parenteral nutrition. And now we took it down, because now we say use reasonable strategies to improve enteral nutrition intolerance, not to improve enteral nutrition tolerance, so treat enteral nutrition intolerance. So, and this is important. We don't need to push absolutely to the maximum with everything we get. We need to respect enteral feeding intolerance as a sign of organ dysfunction first, and maybe also as a sign of metabolic intolerance. Maybe. We don't know yet, and probably not in all patients. I still come back to this. But this is we don't need to push, and we need to probably move from nutrition focused handling of enteral feeding intolerance to GI function focused handling. So we want to improve function and not to put more enteral nutrition in the patient. Why may enteral feeding intolerance be harmful? If it's a maladaptive physiological response that affects outcomes negatively, then it can be directly via GI dysmotility, making bowel distension and negative effect on microbiome, or making regurgitation and aspiration, or it can be indirect effect via inadequate nutritional intake. And this has been all the time the focus. We have all the time said we need to give enterally, and if we cannot give, then enteral feeding intolerance is bad because we couldn't give calories enterally. Because we know enteral nutrition may improve gastrointestinal motility, also enterocyte function, and also mucosal integrity in a few studies shown. But what if enteral feeding intolerance is an adaptive response that is actually appropriate and proportionate to the event? And it is to preserve autophagy. Arthur already explained this before. So the body of the patient tells us, I don't want feeding now, I cannot handle it, don't give it to me. And the manifestation or the way to say, or the marker, is enteral feeding intolerance or GI dysfunction. And also maybe to avoid increased metabolic demand during relative hypoperfusion. And there is a risk of non-occlusive mesenteric ischemia, mainly when you give enteral nutrition post-pylorically, because you couldn't give the gastric enteral nutrition. And why is it important? Because the management is entirely different if it's adaptive or maladaptive. If it's maladaptive, then we should maximize and do everything, like in the former ESPEN guidelines, to do everything to treat the enteral feeding intolerance and to achieve success of enteral nutrition and then improve outcomes. If it is adaptive, then our management strategy should be conservative and observing rather than actively trying to push enteral nutrition. Adaptive responses, of course, you all know, are very common in the ICU, and if they are left untreated or uncontrolled for extended periods, then they may start causing harm, and this we need to consider. And maybe there are both parts in. Maybe enteral feeding intolerance, or in my opinion, it should be observed and left untreated, at least for short periods, taken seriously, respect the sign that the body is giving to us, and probably then should be treated if persisting and leading to severe complications like progressing bowel distension. Somewhen we need to get it working again. And if you look at the risk and management of feeding intolerance, then you see that we make also feeding intolerance with all our drugs and fluids, etc., that we give to our patients. They all lead to GI dysmotility. And also, for example, enteral nutrition towards target causes diarrhea, and we shouldn't forget it. And so in risk factors and management, we have some contradictive parts that we should consider. Importantly, there is no robust evidence that treatment of enteral feeding intolerance with prokinetics improves any patient-centered outcomes. We'll talk about it also tomorrow, but probably achieving some percentage of nutrition is not necessarily patient-important outcome. Just think about it. The patient doesn't probably care if we achieve 70 or 80 or whatever percent of our set target, when we even don't know what our optimal target is. But know that we cause this motility with our treatments, and promoting gastric motility may help to provide nutrition to GI mucosa and microbiome. So it is somewhere in between. It's not black and white. We somewhere need to treat enteral feeding intolerance, probably, and we should avoid bowel distension with not giving too much enteral nutrition, but if needed, then also giving prokinetics to reduce the distension. It has been shown that several complications and severe ones, even though they are rather rare, like bowel ischemia or Ogilvie syndrome, occur if aggressive enteral nutrition is applied. So it is full enteral nutrition during the first few days in the ICU. Outcome of enteral feeding intolerance. Enteral feeding intolerance is associated with adverse outcomes. This has been shown in several studies now already. But it's not clear exactly what is the causality between enteral feeding intolerance and outcome. Now here just a recent study, a small one, just as an example to show how enteral feeding intolerance could be defined or detected. So in this study, the patients mainly had abdominal distension or diarrhea. So any of these GI complications called defined presence of enteral feeding intolerance. And like this, 82% of patients in septic shock had enteral feeding intolerance, a small study, and 32% for all 3 study days. If you look here, then enteral feeding intolerance was independently associated with mortality in 30 days and also in 90 days. And the other components here were age, SOFA score, and renal replacement therapy. It is clear that more severely ill patients more often develop enteral feeding intolerance. However, in several studies, enteral feeding intolerance independently was associated with mortality. My kind of interpretation is that enteral feeding intolerance is a part of GI dysfunction, and GI dysfunction is an organ dysfunction. So it's logical that organ dysfunction is associated with worse outcome. And it's also logical that organ dysfunction occurs in more severely ill patients, even though the organ dysfunction also defines severity of illness, but still. Specific biomarkers are not there at the moment to predict or identify enteral feeding intolerance. Citrulline and intestinal fatty acid binding protein were not clearly related to enteral feeding intolerance in our study that I forgot to put a citation here, obviously. But early enteral nutrition was associated with higher values and different dynamics of citrulline over the first week in the ICU. If now higher citrulline levels meant that we can give more enteral nutrition in this observational study, or citrulline levels increased during the provision of enteral nutrition remains to be clarified. It's not possible in this observational study. Then there is circulating growth differentiation factor 15 that has been shown to be independently related to worse outcomes. And here you see that with low intake, it stayed high. It's better if it goes down. And with high intake, it went down. So could we provide more intake when the factor went down and it was better? Or did it went down because we gave more? Remains to be clarified. Probably, or my interpretation would be that we can give more enteral nutrition to these where the profile of any biomarkers is beneficial. But we should continue research on this. Metabolic response to nutrition, Arthur already very nicely explained a lot about refeeding syndrome, and I think this is also a factor here in the secondary analysis of the EPANIC study, where they looked at decrease in phosphate with more than 0.16 millimole per liter over the first ICU days. And they showed that in the patients receiving early parenteral nutrition, you know that late parenteral nutrition was better in this EPANIC study. They had, the ones who received early parenteral nutrition had actually increased mortality or discharged alive from the ICU rate was lower in these patients. And I think this is very suggestive for refeeding syndrome effect in these patients. Prediction of enteral feeding intolerance was also in the title. I don't know if we absolutely need to predict enteral feeding intolerance. At least I would rather put effort in studies monitoring GI function and trying to find out associations and get clever there rather than predict enteral feeding intolerance. Because we anyway start enteral nutrition at low dose and increase slowly in all ICU patients. Is it different if we predict that the patient might have enteral feeding intolerance? We never predict 100% correctly, right? So would we do differently or not? I don't know. And would we give parenteral nutrition earlier if enteral feeding intolerance is predicted without doing enteral nutrition challenge? I don't know. And if we wouldn't do any of those, then I'm not sure that we need to put our efforts to predict enteral feeding intolerance. There are several efforts to do this, and Apache 2-score age, albumin, intra-abdominal pressure, and mechanical ventilation were predictors. No wonder, no surprise here in these results. And all of these studies didn't actually fulfill the standards requested. So how to do in practice? There are no signs of GI dysfunction, if there is anticipated GI dysfunction, so predicted enteral feeding intolerance, or if there are already signs of GI dysfunction, then depending, of course, on the severity of signs, probably you would still start low-dose enteral nutrition. Very important, monitor. Never go up before you confirmed that this amount that we give is tolerated. And then consider treatment of GI dysmotility, not to achieve maximum enteral nutrition targets, but to improve GI dysfunction. So turn the coin around and try to help GI instead of overloading it with our treatment of GI dysmotility. And then increase enteral nutrition slowly, or consider parenteral nutrition. And it's the same, parenteral nutrition, low dose, slow increase, always. It's never from 0 to 100 concept. And in some patients, enteral nutrition is contraindicated, then consider parenteral nutrition due to this. But low dose and slow increase. And to summarize, my definition of enteral feeding intolerance is worsening of GI function in response to enteral nutrition. So quantification of GI dysfunction after initiation of enteral nutrition is needed. Not blindly go up, look what happens, and look at all the parts, not only gastric residuals. Achieving higher amount of enteral nutrition does not mean that there is now less GI dysfunction. It can be exactly the opposite, and then we probably harm patient. And the paradigm in general should shift from nutrition-focused to GI function-focused management of GI signs and symptoms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the excellent talk, telling us how difficult it could be, what we see in our everyday life. We have some time for questions.
Good morning. Thank you for your excellent talk. Just a question regarding the bedside assessment of the GI dysfunction. Do you recommend using the ultrasound for GI monitoring? Like there are new protocols like the GUTS protocol and so on. Thank you.
Very good question. Thank you very much. Yes, we would like to standardize because now it's just used and looked. But I suggest, yes, use the ultrasound because if you see the bowels very well, then usually something is wrong. So if you see the white bowel filled with fluids, you know that the bowel is distended, right? If there is a lot of air, you don't see. But yes, I recommend to use it, but unfortunately, I don't have a protocol yet. We actually developed a protocol published last year in JPEN, in Journal of Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition, but it includes everything that you could assess with ultrasound, and we are now doing a feasibility study and looking how much is possible to achieve in how many patients and to boil it down to necessary points of assessment, where to look for which sign. But the protocol for ultrasound is definitely needed. But it's easy to see if the stomach is full and if the bowel is fluid filled. It's also easy to see. So use it. You anyway use it for lungs and all the rest. So yes, I support very much. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
Osman Abbasoğlu from Turkey. Thank you very much for your excellent talk. I have a practical question. As you mentioned, enteral nutrition intolerance is very important. In daily life, can you give us a take-home message, step-wise take-home message, how to evaluate these patients? How can we predict GI dysmotility before it develops?
Yeah, I'm actually not in favor of predicting it before it develops because I think we won't be good at it in predicting, so we will be often wrong. But to remark if there are signs coming makes sense to do with low dose. And this is also one additional reason to give low dose in the beginning and then look at all that you can have. Look with ultrasound, measure GRV, monitor vomiting, look at the aspect of the bowels, look at the diarrhea, just try to put all together in this assessment because there is no easy one parameter that tells you anything. But if you started enteral nutrition and the GI symptoms or signs, all of them, any of them, got more rather than less, then you didn't improve GI function with enteral nutrition, but rather made it worse.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Annika, for your kind presentation. Let's move to the next speaker. Next speaker is Professor Mette Berger. Is emeritus professor in Lausanne University and leader of the guidelines, ESPEN guidelines in micronutrients. Her topic is supplemental parenteral nutrition in the ICU. Thank you, Mette.
Thank you for kind introduction, and thank you to ESPEN for organizing this important ICU session and inviting me. Well, supplemental parenteral nutrition. My two colleagues have alluded to the place of PM, and we are going now to see what can be done. My conflicts of interest, mainly that I'm a guideline person. Well, 20 years back, my team and Pia Singer's team published very similar studies, and this is the aggregation of both. And what we observed in patients who were studied prospectively with indirect calorimetry to measure their energy expenditure was that some deficiency in energy balance was tolerated without any problem. But acute underfeeding, shown as a cumulated deficit of energy, was associated with increasing acute underfeeding complication, wound healing issues, pneumonia, ventilator-associated pneumonia. And when this high level, minus 10,000, was reached, then it was bad. Our study was misunderstood, and quite some studies were conducted to say, well, then we start full feeding early on to avoid this, which has proven to be wrong. But look at this cutoff of minus 6,000. It was actually problematic, but not confirmed by others until this study came out. And it comes from the United States. It's in the surgical ICU, and they looked at their patients who had been, with prospective data, either classified as having been fed with lower energy deficits, protein deficits, or higher deficits.